The wind cut through the pines like shrapnel, and Alina Walker pulled her worn military jacket tighter as she trudged through knee-deep snow toward the old cabin. 3 months, that's how long she'd been hiding in these Montana mountains, trying to outrun memories that followed her like smoke from a battlefield. She couldn't forget the cabin sat dark against the white landscape. Just as she'd left it that morning, she'd bought it sight unseen with her discharge pay, a broken-down refuge, where nobody asked questions and the silence was thick enough to muffle the screams that still echoed in her head at night. Alina kicked the snow from her boots and reached for the door handle, but something made her pause, a sound barely audible over the howling wind, but there a whimper, weak and desperate. She turned slowly, scanning the tree line with the same methodical sweep she'd used to check for snipers in Kandahar. There, about 50 yards out, near the massive oak that stood sentinel at the forest's edge, something dark against the white bark. Alina's breath caught as she moved closer. Tied to the tree with a length of chain was a dog, a German shepherd. She realized, though his thick coat was matted with ice and snow, he lay on his side, barely moving, his ribs visible through his fur. Frost covered his muzzle, and his eyes looked so human, so haunted. Jesus, she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. Who did this to you? The dog's tail made the faintest attempt at a wag. Alina's hands shook as she examined the chain, padlocked with no collar or tags in sight, just a number tattooed inside his ear. K947 military marking. She'd seen enough of them in her 2 tours to know what it mean. You're military, aren't you, boy? She worked at the lock with numb fingers. The metal was so cold it burned. Someone just left you here to die. The dog whimpered again, trying to lift his head. Alina could see the intelligence in his amber eyes. The training, this wasn't some stray, this was a soldier. The lock finally gave way with a sharp click that echoed through the forest. Alina gathered the dog in her arms, surprised by how light he felt. To light his breathing was shallow, labored. Come on, soldier, she murmured, carrying him back through the storm. We don't leave anyone behind. The wind picked up as she struggled through the snow, and with it came the memories she'd been running from. Martinez bleeding out in her arms, the eye that should have killed her instead of Thompson, the way command had looked at her after the incident. Like she was broken, unreliable, a liability. The dog stirred in her arms, his eyes opening to look at her with an expression she recognized. It was the same look she'd seen in her mirror every morning for the past year, the look of someone who'd seen too much, survived too much, been left behind by everyone who was supposed to cry. No, she whispered, against his frozen fur. I know exactly how you feel inside the cabin. Alina laid the dog on the rug by the fireplace and got a fire going. The light danced across his fur, revealing old scars beneath the ice-bite marks, what looked like electrical burns, surgical scars along his legs. Her stomach churned. What did they do to you? She asked, though she was starting to suspect she didn't want to know. The answer: she heated water and carefully cleaned the ice from his fur, talking to him the whole time. Partly for his comfort, partly for her own. It had been months since she'd spoken to another living being. Going to be okay, she said, wrapping him in blankets. Whatever happened before, whatever they did, that's over now. You're safe. The dog's breathing gradually steadied, and some warmth returned to his nose. Alina found a can of beef stew in her sparse pantry and heated it up, feeding him small spoonfuls. He ate hungrily but carefully, like he'd learned not to trust that food would always be there. As the storm raged outside, Alina sat beside him, her hand resting on his side to feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing. For the first time in months, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. You know what? She said softly. I think we're going to be good for each other. The dog turned his head to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw something that made her heart crack open. Just a little gratitude. Yes, but also recognition, like he knew she was just as lost as he was. Alina had come to these mountains to hide from her past, to disappear from a world that had no use for broken soldiers. But as she watched this scarred, abandoned canine fight his way back from the edge of death, she realized that maybe being found was exactly what they both needed. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, and for the first time since coming home from the war, Alina Walker didn't feel completely alone. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the pines, but inside, 2 wounded soldiers had found something worth fighting for. Alina woke to the sound of whimpering gray dawn light filtered through the cabin windows, and she found the dog. She'd been thinking of him as K947, but that felt too cold, too military. Thrashing in his sleep on the rug, his legs kicked frantically like he was running, and low growls rumbled from his throat. "Z boy," she whispered, kneeling beside him. The moment her hand touched his shoulder, he jerked awake, amber eyes wild and unfocused. For a split second, she saw her reflection in them, the same startled panic she wore after her own nightmares. Okay, she said, keeping her voice calm and steady. You're safe. Just a dream. The dog blinked slowly, recognition returning to his gaze. He licked her hand, a tentative gesture, like he was testing whether this kindness was real. Alina had been awake since 3 anyway, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about the pills in her backpack, the ones she'd been saving for when the memories became too much to bear. Finding him had given her something else to focus on, a reason to get up that morning. She made coffee and scrambled some eggs. Sharing them with her unexpected houseguest, he ate with the same careful hunger as the night before, but she noticed how he watched her every movement, learning her patterns. "You need a name," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "K947 is what they called you, but that's not who you are." She studied his dark coat, the way he seemed to blend with the shadows cast by the fire. "Shadow, that fits, doesn't it?" Shadow's ears perked up at the name, and his tail gave a tentative wag. Alina smiled, the first real smile she'd managed in months over. The next few days Alina watched Shadow grow stronger. His appetite returned, the dullness left his eyes, and he began to move around the cabin with more confidence. But the more time she spent with him, the more questions arose. It started with small things. When Alina dropped a pot in the kitchen, Shadow immediately went into a defensive crouch, scanning for threats. When she spoke sharply to herself over a spilled cup of coffee, he froze at attention, waiting for orders. But it was the military commands that really unsettled her. Alina had been a communications specialist, not a canine handler. But she'd worked around enough military dogs to know the basic commands. Almost without thinking, she'd said, "Sit," in the sharp, authoritative tone she'd learned in basic training. Shadow had dropped into a perfect sitting position instantly, with the kind of precision that took months of intensive training to achieve. Stays she'd commanded, and he'd remained motionless even when she walked to the far side of the cabin. "Come," and he'd trotted to her side, sitting automatically at her left heel. These weren't pet tricks. This was military-grade training, the kind used for bomb detection, patrol work, or Alina shoved that thought away. She didn't want to know what else military dogs were trained for. She'd seen enough of what the government was willing to do to its soldiers. Shadow followed her everywhere. Now, like a furry shadow indeed. When she chopped wood, he lay nearby, alert and watchful. When she read by the fire, in the evenings, he rested his head on her feet. When she awoke from nightmares, he was always there, a warm presence in the darkness. But he had his own demons. The nightmares came almost every night, the running, the whimpering, sometimes even howling, that echoed through the cabin like a battle cry, and there were triggers. Alina was still learning about Sudan. Loud noises sent him into high alert. The sound of helicopters passing overhead made him whine and pace. One afternoon, when Alina's phone rang with an unknown number, Shadow had bolted outside and wouldn't come back until the ringing stopped. It was during one of these episodes that Alina noticed the scarred bin, brushing the tangles from his coat. When she found them, thin, precise marks along his skull, mostly hidden by fur, surgical scars. Not from injury, but from deliberate procedures. "What did they do to you?" she whispered, her fingers tracing the mark. Shadow turned to look at her with those two knowing eyes, and Alina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air that night. As they sat by the fire, Alina found herself talking to him like she hadn't talked to another living being in years. Maybe it was because he couldn't judge her, couldn't report back to commanding officers or therapists or anyone else who thought they knew what was best for Harry. "He used to be good at my job," she said, staring into the flames. "Communications, I could patch together a signal in the middle of a sandstorm, coordinate airstrikes, talk to base command while mortars were falling all around us. My team depended on my." Shadow shifted closer, resting his head on her thigh. "But after Martinez died, I couldn't focus, started making mistakes, missing transmissions. Command said I had PTSD, recommended treatment. They had these doctors, these programs." She shuddered. "I got out before they could send me to one of their facilities. Heard too many stories about soldiers who went in and came out different." Shadow winced softly, as if he understood. Alina scratched behind his ears, feeling the ridge of scar tissue beneath her fingers. "You were in one of those programs, weren't you?" she asked. "That's why someone left you to die. You knew too much, or you stopped being useful." Or she couldn't finish the thought. The idea that the same government she'd served would abandon a loyal soldier, human or canine, to freeze to death in the wilderness was almost too much to bear. But as she looked into Shadow's amber eyes, she saw her own story reflected back at her. Two broken soldiers, discarded by the system they'd served faithfully. Two survivors who'd found each other in the darkness. "Well," she said, her voice steadier now, "they threw us away, but we're still here, and we're going to be okay, together." Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor, and Alina felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering their tracks and hiding them from a world that had decided they were no longer needed. But inside the warm cabin, two soldiers had found something the government couldn't take away from them. They at each other. Lena jerked awake to the sound of Shadow's low, urgent growling. The cabin was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace, and she could barely make out his silhouette by the window, every muscle tense. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, reaching for the Glock she kept under her pillow. Habits from a war that never really ended. Thunder rolled across the mountains, followed by the steady drum of rain against the roof. A spring storm had moved in while they slept, melting the snow and turning the world into a maze of shadows and rushing water. Shadow's growl deepened. He paced to the door, then back to Alina, his agitation growing by the second. "Shadow, what?" Before she could finish, he bolted. The dog door she'd installed last week slammed open as he shot out into the storm, his barking swallowed by the wind and rain. "Shadow." Alina grabbed her jacket and flashlight, cursing as she stumbled into her boots. "Shadow, come back." The rain hit her like a physical blow as she stepped outside. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating sheets of water cascading from the cabin's roof. No sign of Shadow anywhere. His barking echoed from somewhere deep in the forest, urgent and commanding. Alina had heard that tone before. Military dogs alerting their handlers to danger, to a find, to something that demanded immediate attention. She plunged into the woods following the sound of his voice. Branches whipped at her face and her boots squelched through mud and standing water. The storm had transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and treacherous. Shadow, here, boy. His barking grew louder, more insistent. Alina pushed through a thick stand of pines and nearly fell as the ground dropped away beneath her feet. Her flashlight beam swept downward, revealing what looked like a concrete wall covered in decades of moss and debris. Shadow stood at the bottom of the depression, pawing frantically at a metal door set into the hillside, a bunker hidden so well that even with the rain washing away layers of earth and vegetation, she almost missed it. What the hell? Alina slid down the muddy slope, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door was military-grade with warning signs in multiple languages. Most were too faded to read, but she could make out fragments. Authorized, personnel only, and lethal force authorized, and something in Russian that made her stomach turn. Shadow wind and scratched at the doorframe. The lock had been corroded by decades of weather, and Alina found she could force it open with her. Smell hit her first: disinfectant and decay metal and something else. She couldn't identify. Her flashlight revealed a narrow corridor leading into the darkness. Stay close, she whispered to Shadow, though he was already moving ahead, nose to the ground, following some scent trail. Only he could detect the bunker was larger than she'd expected, with multiple rooms branching off the main corridor. Elena's light played over abandoned equipment, computers from the 1980s. Filing cabinets with their drawers hanging open like broken teeth, but it was the cages that made her blood run cold. Room after room of them stacked floor to ceiling, metal kennels, barely large enough for a full-grown dog to turn around. Most were empty now, but some still contained the remnants of bedding, food bowls, and toys. Pathetic attempts to make prison cells feel like home. Shadow moved through the maze of cages with grim purpose, pausing here and there to sniff at particular spots. When he reached the far end of the room, he sat down and howled, a sound so full of anguish that Alina felt it in her bones. Her flashlight beam fell on a wall covered in photographs and charts. Dogs in military harnesses. Dogs hooked up to machines she couldn't identify. Dogs with electrodes attached to their skulls, wires running to computers that hummed with malevolent purpose. There in the center of it all, a photo that made her gasp. A younger Shadow, his coat still glossy, his eyes bright with intelligence and trust. Below the photo, a file labeled K947, Cognitive Enhancement Trial 15. With shaking hands, Alina pulled the file from its clip. The pages were yellow with age but still readable. What she saw made her sick. Subject demonstrates exceptional learning capacity. Following neuromodification procedures, responds to complex command sequences, shows signs of enhanced tactical awareness and problem-solving abilities. She flipped pages, her horror growing with each line. Subject requires constant sedation following Procedure 7. Aggressive behavior toward handlers. Recommend psychological conditioning protocols. Trial 12. Subject successfully completed maze in record time but showed signs of severe psychological trauma. Memory suppression techniques. Partially successful. Final recommendation. Subject K947. Unsuitable for field deployment due to psychological instability. Recommend termination. Alina's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the file. They hadn't just trained Shadow, they'd experimented on him. Cut into his brain, tried to turn him into some kind of super soldier, and when it didn't work perfectly, they'd decided to kill him. But someone had helped him escape. Instead, someone with enough conscience left to turn him loose rather than put a bullet in his head. Shadow pressed against her leg, whining softly. Alina knelt and wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the scars beneath his fur with new understanding. Him. So sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry they did this to you. Day stuffed the file into her jacket and was turning to leave when her light caught something else. Another stack of files labeled with different numbers. Casey, all of them dozens of dogs who'd been through the same hell as Shadow, but it was the human files that made her blood freeze. Project Bridge. Human TRRAL. Selena pulled the folder with numb fingers. Inside were photos of soldiers, men and women she recognized from her own service, people who'd been reported as Kier or Mia, but who were very much alive in these pictures. Alive and strapped to tables, wires attached to their skulls, just like the dogs at the bottom of the stack. A file that made her heart stop. Her own photo, her own name, a stamp that read, Recruitment, APPROVD. Shadow barked sharply and Alina spun toward the entrance. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Multiple people moving with military precision. Ina killed her flashlight and pressed herself against the wall, pulling Shadow close. Through the darkness she could hear voices. Motion sensors picked up movement. About an hour ago. Could be an animal. The storm knocked out half our equipment. We need to do a visual sweep. If someone found this place, then we clean it up. Same as always. Alina's blood turned to ice. They were still operational. After all these years, whatever sick program had created this place was still running and now they knew she'd found it. Alana waited until the footsteps moved past their hiding spot, then crept toward a different exit. She'd spotted earlier, Shadow followed silently, his military training evident in every careful step. They slipped out into the storm and made their way back through the forest. But Alina knew their time at the cabin was over by morning. They'd have people crawling all over these mountains as they reached the cabin. Alina's mind was already racing through their options. They needed to disappear, and they needed to do it fast. But first, she had calls to make people who needed to know that their government was still cutting up soldiers like lab rats, still treating human beings like expendable test subjects. Shadow had led her to the truth, and now they both had targets on their backs, but Alina Walker had been a communications specialist. She knew how to get a message out even when people didn't want it sent, and this was one message the world needed to hear. Alina had exactly 47 minutes to learn to pack fast in the military combat load in under 3 minutes, full kit in under 10. But this was different. This wasn't redeployment to another forward operating base. This was running for their lives. Shadow paced by the window, his ears constantly swiveling as he tracked sounds. Alina couldn't hear. Every few minutes he'd growl low in his throat, then settle back into watchful silence. Alina stuffed the stolen files into a waterproof bag, along with her emergency cache, fake ID, and the encrypted phone she'd hoped she'd never have to use. The secure line had cost her 3 months of disability pay, but when she'd made her call 2 hours ago, voice disguised, location masked, she knew it had been worth every penny. Walker. The voice on the other end had been cautious, but familiar. Captain Sarah Chen, her former unit commander, now working private security. I need you to listen carefully. I don't have much time. Jesus. Alina, where are you? Command's been lying about everything. I found something. Sarah, something big. Alina had given her the coordinates of the bunker, told her about the files about Shadow. Chen had listened in growing silence. Send backup, Chen had finally said, but it'll take us 6 hours to reach you. Can you hold out that long? I don't think so. They're coming then. Run, get as far away as you can. We'll find you now. Alina cinched her backpack tight and turned to Shadow. Time to go. Soldier. Shadow's head snapped toward the door. Just as Alina heard it, the distant rumble of helicopters, multiple birds moving fast and low. Through the window she could see lights sweeping the forest, searchlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. They burst out the back door as the first helicopter crested the ridge. Alina had chosen this cabin partly for its remote location, but also for the escape routes. A network of old mining trails snaked through these mountains. Invisible from the air, they made it to the tree line. Just as boots hit the ground behind them, Alina risked a glance back and counted at least 8 figures in tactical gear, spreading out from the cabin. This is not a drill, someone shouted through a megaphone. We have authority to use lethal force. Surrender now and you will not be harmed. Alina almost laughed. She'd seen what their idea of not being harmed looked like in those files. Shadow led the way through the darkness, his enhanced senses navigating obstacles Alina couldn't see. They followed a deer trail down into a ravine where the sound of rushing water would mask their footsteps. For 30 minutes, they pushed through brush and over loose rock, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers. Alina was starting to think they might actually make it when Shadow froze, his hackles rising. 3 red laser dots danced across Alina's chest. Didn't move. A voice called from the darkness ahead. Hands, where we can see them. Alina raised her hands slowly, calculating angles and distances. 3 shooters spread out in a standard tactical formation. Professional but not military, private contractors. Probably the dog. To the voice commanded, call him off. Shadow, stay. Alina said softly. The largest of the 3 figures stepped forward, night vision goggles pushed up on his forehead. Alina recognized the type. Former Special Forces, the kind of soldier who went private when the military couldn't pay him enough anymore. Ms. Walker, he said, his voice almost conversational. You've caused us a lot of trouble tonight. Just a hiker who got lost. Alina replied, don't know what trouble you're talking about. Ban smiled without humor. Come on, Alina, we know you found the facility. We know you took the files. We know you made a phone call. Lene's heart sank. They'd been monitoring her communications all along. Here's how this is going to work. The contractor continued. You're going to come with us quietly. We're going to have a conversation about what you saw, who you talked to, and then we're going to help you understand why some things are better left buried in shadow. The man glanced at the dog, who hadn't moved but was vibrating with barely contained energy. The asset will be returned to the program. He's not an asset, Alina snarled. He's a soldier. He served his country. He's government property. The contractor corrected. Expensive property that needs to be recovered. Alina saw Shadow's muscles bunch. The dog understood. More than anyone realized, he knew these people knew what they represented. Shadow, she said quietly, remember what we talked about not being left behind. The dog's amber eyes flicked to her, and Alina saw understanding. There they'd spent weeks building trust, learning to work together. Now she was counting on that bond to save both their lives. Attack she whispered. Shadow exploded into motion. 90 pounds of enhanced military K9 hit the lead contractor before he could bring his weapon. Up they went down in a tangle of arms and legs, the man's screams echoing through the ravine. Elena rolled left as the other two opened fire, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness. She came up behind a fallen log and drew her Glock, returning fire. With the precision drilled into her, at Benning one, shooter dropped immediately. The second took cover behind a tree, but Shadow was already moving, using the tactics they'd programmed into his enhanced brain. He flanked left while Elena kept the man pinned down, then struck from the blind side. In less than 30 seconds, it was over. Elena knelt beside Shadow, checking him for injuries. He had a graze along his shoulder where a bullet had clipped him, but he was alert and mobile. Good boy, she whispered, her hand shaking as she applied pressure to the wound. Such a good boy. Shadow licked her face, his tail wagging despite the pain in his eyes. Elena saw something she recognized, the satisfaction of a soldier who'd completed the mission they gathered. The contractor's weapons and communication equipment then melted back into the forest. Elena knew this was just the first wave. There would be others, but they'd bought themselves time, and with Chen's backup on the way, they had a chance as they climbed toward the high passes where helicopters would have trouble following. Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The fierce joy of combat, of surviving against impossible odds. She'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone she could trust, absolutely someone who would follow her into hell and fight beside her no matter what. Shadow wasn't just her companion anymore. He was her battle buddy, her packmate, her brother in arms, and together they were going to make sure the world learned what had been done in those underground rooms. The hunt was far from over, but Elena Walker and Shadow weren't running anymore. They were fighting back. Dawn broke gray and cold over the mountain pass where Elena and Shadow had taken refuge from there. Positioned behind a cluster of boulders, Elena could see the entire valley spread out below, including the 3 helicopters that had been circling like vultures for the past 2 hours. Shadow lay pressed against her side, his breathing steady despite the bullet graze on his shoulder. She'd cleaned and bandaged the wound as best she could with their limited supplies, but he needed proper medical attention. Elena checked her watch. Chen's backup team should have reached the bunker by now if they'd found the evidence, if they could get it to the right people. Movement 2 o'clock, she whispered to Shadow. His ears perked up as Elena focused her binoculars on the tree line. A full tactical team was working their way up the mountain, at least a dozen operators in military gear, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that meant serious training and serious money. Elena counted their weapons, assessed their formation. These weren't the contractors from last night, this was the first string, the people who cleaned up the biggest messes. Her encrypted phone buzzed. A text from Chen. Package delivered, story breaking in 30 minutes. Hold position. Elena smiled grimly. Whatever happened next, the truth was out there now. The bunker, the files, the evidence of what had been done to soldiers like Shadow, it would all be public knowledge within the hour. But first they had to survive long enough to see it. The tactical team had split into 3 groups, trying to box them in. Elena studied their approach, routes, calculating angles and timing. They had superior numbers and equipment, but she had the high ground and something they didn't expect. It partner who'd been literally designed for this kind of fight. Shadow, she said quietly, remember, your training, not theirs, ours. The things we learned together. Shadow's amber eyes locked onto hers, and Elena saw complete understanding. They'd spent months building trust, learning each other's signals, becoming a team. Now it was time to put that partnership to the test. The first group reached the rocks below their position. Elena let them get close, waiting until they were committed to their approach route. Then she gave Shadow the hand signal they'd practiced. He ghosted away through the boulders, using his enhanced abilities to move silent as smoke. Elena counted to 10, then opened fire. Her first shot scattered the lead team, sending them diving for cover, but they were professionals. They regrouped quickly, laying down suppressing fire while 2 men tried to flank her position. That's when Shadow struck. He hit the first flanker from behind, taking him down without a sound. The second man spun toward the commotion and found 90 pounds of enhanced military K9 airborne and aimed at his throat. Elena shifted position as the remaining team members tried to coordinate their response. These weren't weekend warriors. They adapted quickly, using squad tactics and covering fire, but they were used to fighting human. Moved like a ghost through their formation, appearing and disappearing among the rocks. His enhanced training had been designed to create the perfect military asset, and now he was using every bit of that programming to protect the one person who'd shown him kindness. The battle raged for 20 minutes. Elena used every trick she'd learned in 2 combat tours, every bit of knowledge from her military training, but it was Shadow who turned the tide. His enhanced senses, his perfect tactical awareness, his ability to strike from angles no human could anticipate. When the shooting finally stopped, Elena found herself looking down at a valley full of helicopters with nowhere to land, tactical teams with no clear targets, and a communication network that was about to be flooded with the biggest military scandal in decades. Her phone rang. Chen's voice was tight with excitement. Lena, where are you? Every news network in the country is running the story. Congress is calling for investigations. The Pentagon is in full damage control. Modware alive, Elena said, checking Shadow's bandage. Barely, but alive. There's extraction teams moving to your position, legitimate ones this time, FBI. Congressional investigators. The people who are going to want to hear your story. Alina looked at Shadow, who was watching the valley below with alert eyes. And Shadow, there's already talk about a congressional medal for military service animals, Chen said. Turns out there were a lot more dogs in that program than anyone realized. Shadow might be the only survivor as Alina waited for the legitimate extraction team. She thought about the journey that had brought them here. She'd come to these mountains broken and hopeless, ready to give up on a world that had discarded her like damaged equipment. Instead, she'd found Shadow, another discarded soldier, who'd been thrown away when he was no longer useful. Together, they'd uncovered a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, fought off trained killers, and survived against impossible odds. But more than that, they'd saved each other. The helicopters that finally landed were different. FBI markings, congressional seals. A kind of official attention that meant accountability rather than cover-ups. Alina and Shadow walked down the mountain together, no longer running, no longer hiding. The investigation would take months. There would be testimony, trials, congressional hearings. Shadow would need surgery to repair some of the damage done by his enhancement procedures, and Alina would need therapy to deal with everything she'd discovered. But they'd face it together 3 months later. Alina stood in the Rose Garden as Shadow received the first ever Congressional Medal of Honor for military working dogs. His coat was glossy again, his eyes bright with health and happiness. The surgical scars were still there, but they were healing. Just like Alina herself, the ceremony was covered by every major network, and Alina's story had already been optioned for a movie. But what mattered most was watching Shadow work with other veterans, using his enhanced abilities to help soldiers deal with PTSD. And trauma had been created as a weapon, but he'd chosen to become a healer. After the ceremony, Alina and Shadow walked across the South Lawn together. She'd been offered a job with the FBI's new K9 program, and Shadow would be her partner officially this time, with all the respect and support they deserved. So Alina said, looking down at her battle buddy, her packmate, her brother in arms, ready for the next mission. Shadow looked up at her with those amber eyes that held such intelligence and trust, and his tail wagged once. Together they headed toward whatever came next, to soldiers who'd found their way home at last.